thanks everyone for being here. For the Berkeley students who are in class, please take your seats. Okay, great. Thanks everyone for being here, and welcome to the second lecture in our Entrepreneurship in Web3 class. And I hope everyone enjoyed the first class. And I think we got a lot of excitement from the students and also from the community. Also the YouTube views from the lecture videos. Already we have like thousands of views, and we hear a lot of really exciting feedback. So yeah, thanks everyone. So today is our great honor and pleasure to welcome Dan Robinson, Head of Research from Paradigm, to talk about Web3 landscape. So actually for the next 3 lectures, we are going to give students an overview of the Web3 landscape. And today is part 1, focusing on L1, L2 infrastructure, CeFi, DeFi, and service provider, and so on. So with that, thanks Dan, and Hasib is here as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Don. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to be talking about give you just an overview of the some parts of the Web3 landscape, and then in the next couple lectures after this, other guests will be talking about some other parts. For this, anybody, please feel free to interrupt or raise your hand at any time with questions. Happy to go in depth on anything else here, or answer other questions people have during the talk. And then if you're online and watching this live, feel free to ask anything in the chat, and they tell me they'll ask it over here. So happy to get into any questions there. Little background on me: I'm head of research at Paradigm, which is a crypto asset investment firm. I should say Paradigm is we're a crypto asset investment firm. We're invested in a lot of projects across the space, including some of the ones, not all, that we'll be talking about today. But this talk is not about investing. It's not about how to evaluate a project as an investor. It's about how to think about ideas as an entrepreneur. And so when you're looking out into the space as an entrepreneur, you're often thinking just what's the missing piece there. And so this is about trying to evaluate that. This is not how I would necessarily go about evaluating whether something's a good investment. And certainly, please, nothing that I talk about here is investment advice or legal advice. I actually started my career as a lawyer, but I wasn't very good at it. So I'm not going to be giving you any kind of legal advice here, nor investment advice. I'm also only when I'm talking about some of these projects, only representing my own views. And finally, when we talk about case studies in this lecture, we're trying to demonstrate this general principle or kind of an idealized category for some of these businesses that could be built in Web3. So some of the specific examples here, I'm going to give a somewhat simplistic view of their business model. And this is not going in depth on sort of the again, a business evaluation of these things. It's more thinking about the spot that they occupy in the market. Because again, when you're thinking about an idea, and if you want to start something, you're not going to have a lot of numbers necessarily to go by yet. You might be trying to fill a space that hasn't actually been that nobody else can even really see clearly. And so this is useful really when you're just navigating the idea maze. And so again, like thinking about these things, we're thinking like, how would we maybe have come up with some of these if we were trying to think of an idea? So the categories I'm going to be talking about include a lot of the ones that I've focused on during my time in the space. And so that includes these layer 1 and layer 2 platforms on which a lot of other applications are built, includes other infrastructure that is needed to support these platforms and the applications built on top of them. And it includes financial apps in crypto, both centralized ones and decentralized ones would have been called DeFi. And I'm going to be giving a fairly introductory overview of some of these topics. If you have deeper questions, I'm happy to get into them now, but I want to make sure I'm laying the groundwork of when you're looking across the space, thinking about what you might want to actually fit into as an entrepreneur. So like I said, the motivating question for me here is how would I decide what to build if I wanted to start a company in crypto or Web3 today? And here are some of the questions that I think are useful when you're evaluating that. There are other questions certainly about like, so that might be specific to you, but what can you actually contribute? What's your, what individually you passionate about, and what's your personal experience? But when looking at an idea and just thinking in the abstract, is this something that potentially could be worth devoting 10 plus years of my life to? These are some of the kind of questions that I would start with. So first is, what's the actual problem that we're addressing? If there's not something out there that someone who desperately really needs your product, it can be very hard to push something out into the world. And so figuring out like who is out there with a particular pain. What is differentiating your solution from others that already exist out there? And often that will depend on, do you have a key insight into some particular piece of how to solve this puzzle, or are you looking at it in a different way, or do you have some experience that makes you particularly able to do this? The customer, like I said, every really good startup, there should be someone out there who really needs this. And so figuring out who are you going after, who is this targeted at, and finding real identifiable people out there in the world that you can go talk to about this problem is really useful. What's the moat for this idea? How would I defend it in the long run against competition? And a lot of I think really great ideas and really powerful technologies, it turns out it's very hard to build a business around them, because ultimately any profit that you make will be competed down to zero by other competitors. And so thinking about with your business, what's actually my moat here is a very important question when you're thinking long term. Early on, it may not always be clear. Similarly, a business model, a lot of ideas, it's just hard to actually find a way to extract money from them and to capture value in a way that is able to keep paying your employees' salaries and make it possible for you to raise money. I think, again, this is something that in early stage ideas, you may not have a very clear idea of, but I think as we'll talk about, you can sometimes get a sense when you're working on something, you don't know the exact business model, but you can tell it's adjacent to some, either a fast stream or a giant pile of money. And so all you have to do is figure out, how do I actually just like reach out and grab some of that when I'm in this position with this startup. And so those are the kinds of a lot of the startups we're talking about today. And that might be a sign that that there's sort of a clear business model there. Whereas again, in some other areas, there can be fantastic technology. You can make a big difference to the world, but it's hard to ultimately make that into a successful business. So these are the questions we'll be asking about each of the case studies that we go over today. So first, I think we'll start with talking about layer ones. So when we say layer one in crypto, typically we're talking about blockchain platforms. The original quote unquote layer one platform, Bitcoin, was its own blockchain and also its own decentralized currency on that blockchain. And typically every blockchain has one native cryptocurrency, and that's often the currency that block rewards are paid out depending on the consensus mechanism. It's often used as a kind of money on that chain, although not always. But generally what modern blockchains do is, in addition to potentially running their own application, they can be a platform that allows other applications to be built on top of them. They manage the state and the access layer and the core business logic of your application. And of course, a blockchain, some of the primitives that it provides, such as being hard to reorg, accessible to anybody in the world permissionlessly, composable with other applications. These are useful things that this can provide to any application that's building on top of it. And so, there are some platforms are special purpose chains. For example, trying to solve a particular problem like payments. But then a lot of other layer one platforms, including a lot of the ones that are being released today, they're generally programmable, meaning they're meant to be platforms for other applications to be built on top of them. So Ethereum is one such example and the biggest of those, but there are many others that have been launched since. And this has typically been considered one of the biggest prizes in terms of building like a really impactful business in crypto, but it's also a very difficult one to pull off.
So Dan, a quick question. Would you say that anything that is a blockchain is a layer one?
I mean, I certainly use it that way. So what Steve asked for those in the room is whether anything that is a blockchain is a layer one. I use it that way. Like I would say like Bitcoin is a layer one. I think if you want it to be like persnickety about it, you might say it's only a layer one if you can build other things on top of it. But again, in a lot of cases, you can build other stuff on it. What would you say?
I think I agree with your latter definition. Like, I would not look at an application specific chain. Like, there's some of these DeFi protocols that have their own blockchain. I wouldn't call that a layer one. I think a layer one implies that there's other layers that we're going to be talking about shortly.
Yeah.
But I want to make clear for everybody, when we say layer one, usually what we don't mean is just anything that's a blockchain. Layer ones, when we talk about them, most of the time we're talking about the base application layer, meaning that it's like the platform on which you build other stuff. It's like the operating system for other applications.
Yeah, I mean, and that's true. In fact, a lot of the other ideas I'll be talking about, particularly like in DeFi, any of those things potentially could be in their own applications, but that wouldn't necessarily mean it's its own L1. That's right. And so when you're thinking about building an L1, yeah, often you're thinking about what are sort of the what would I actually need to do to attract applications, not just users, but applications to my chain. And so so thinking about it as a platform. So here, like I mentioned, a lot of these case studies are going to be highly abstracted, idealized versions of these businesses. And so here I'm talking about a few layer one blockchains that share a few common traits and I think some of the same essential approach to solving this business problem. So the problem that a lot of these are starting, this is Solana, Polygon, and Avalanche. And so the backstory on this, and Hasib and I were around for this period, is there was a time around 2017, 2018, 2019, when a lot of people basically looked at Ethereum, which had at the time relatively low transaction fees, and thought, eventually this is going to hit a peak. Eventually we're going to run out of room in this blockchain. And I think this took some amount of vision, because again, at the time, like transaction, other than during the bull market at the time, sometimes blocks had been full, but transaction fees that people were generally paying had never really spiked that high. But in 2018, 2019, a lot of people saw this, predicted effectively that this would be a problem and would make it hard for people to build applications on in the long run, and started building platforms that would essentially fill this need when it came time down the line. And it takes a few years generally to launch a new layer one platform. It's a very complicated endeavor. And so the people who started building around 2017, 2018, 2019, they started launching in 2020, 2021, 2022. And luckily, or again, maybe just according to their plan, that was around the same time when Ethereum transaction fees just went through the roof. So demand for Ethereum, for transacting on Ethereum, for a lot of reasons, went really high. People started paying, people previously had been paying less than $1 for a transaction. People started paying $20 or more for simple transactions, and more even in times of congestion or for complicated transactions. So that became so a lot of these other layer one platforms that had been building toward this for the previous couple of years started really maturing and finding that there was actually demand for it. It's still very hard to bootstrap a layer one platform like this. You still need applications to come and for users to come, and there's a loop there where users only want to join a chain if there's applications, and applications only want to go to a chain if there's users. That could be very hard to bootstrap. But like as I have here, that's what where the moat in the long run potentially comes from. If you build the winning layer one platform, that means you have the applications that make users want to come to your chain. It means you have the users that makes applications want to build on your chain. And it means that applications, when they come to your chain, they can interact with other applications that are already there. So this is considered one of the most powerful moats, and one of the reasons why this is considered one of the biggest prizes in among possible crypto business to build. So, like I said, I think all these I'm not going to get too much into the technical details on how these work. They all attempt to achieve low transaction fees and high throughput in their own ways. But yeah, again, I think the core groups that they're targeting is anyone building applications. I would think of really the applications as maybe the main customers in some sense of a lot of these platforms, because that's really what they're optimizing for. And then the users are basically the bait. Like if you have users, that's what gets you to be able to track the applications. Yeah, and then the business model for these is generally speaking, transaction fees that people are paying for transacting on these chains.
So Dan,
on
one question somebody asked online is, it seems a bit paradoxical to claim that the moat of like one of these emerging layer ones is the network effect. Why was that not true for Ethereum? Like, why doesn't Ethereum have this moat of a network effect if these other guys are also able to have this moat of a network effect? It seems like, okay, well, is that really even a moat then?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the argument here would be, I think it's a great question. In fact, I think I would say Ethereum still has an incredibly strong network effect. And so like the demand to build on Ethereum, despite currently the transaction fees being quite a lot higher than they are on many other chains. It's sort of like Yogi Berra says, nobody goes there anymore, it's too crowded. The reason these transaction fees are high is because people really want to use it. Applications still really want to build on it. And so it is a fairly strong network effect. In order to dethrone a network effect, typically you do have to have some kind of, or it's easiest to have if you have some kind of technological innovation, or if you make a particular trade-off in a new way that makes it possible to do something 10 times as much or 10 times better than the previous business that you're trying to disrupt, that you're trying to steal the network effect. And so I think it's to be determined whether any of the other entrants will be able to actually build up a network effect that surpasses Ethereum's. But again, I think their strategy is we're going to be providing low transaction fees, and that's something that generally applications do really want, and users typically want, and hope that that's enough to build up their own. But it doesn't necessarily hurt Ethereum that there's so many entrants, and so it's kind of there's a possibility that you get what's called like a circular firing squad, where everyone out there is competing, and so nobody's able to really build up their own network effect, and Ethereum's sort of just more slowly continues to grow theirs. So that's like one of the big $1 trillion questions in crypto. I wish I had a certain answer to it. Yeah. Any other questions?
Another question is, how do these competitors, these alternative layer ones, how do they try to bootstrap activity by attracting attention away from Ethereum?
Yeah, so one common strategy for trying to basically shift that equilibrium. Right now, like I said, there's this network effect, this equilibrium of users and applications. Like users go where the applications go where the users go, and right now that mostly is on Ethereum. So one of the ways is through subsidies. And so there's been a lot of innovation in crypto around ways to try to disrupt an existing business model, but basically paying people to switch or paying applications to switch. And this is sometimes done in ways that it's done in traditional and Web2 or in traditional business, where you make these business development deals and you like give grants to projects to build on your system. But it's also often done in these new innovative ways in what's called yield farming, where you pay people in tokens in an automated way to basically just be doing something on your platform. And we'll talk again about yield farming in the context of DeFi. But it's a user acquisition strategy that can be a very blunt instrument, but a very powerful one, and potentially again like something that can try to disrupt those kinds of network effects. Yeah, I have a question here.
Oh yeah. So I was wondering that like a bunch of chains usually try to become Evm compatible. Is that like a network effect that benefits Ethereum even in the long term? If like something like CK is saying is Evm compatible, whereas something like Starkware is using Pyro, like what is that something that benefits Ethereum in itself, even though other chains are trying to become Evm compatible, or is that like a way for a chain to like get users into its environment? Like how does that network effect who's benefiting?
The question is whether EVM compatible platforms, which a lot of these are, so Avalanche and Polygon, for example, that I have the examples here, are EVM equivalent chains. Whether that ultimately benefits Ethereum, which pioneered the EVM, I think it benefits it in that the EVM effectively has its own network effect among ways to program blockchains, right? So like the EVM is not a business; it's a VM, right? It's a way to do this thing, and I think it does have its own independent network effect that, in my view, has been fairly strong and getting stronger. Certainly, an example like JavaScript was a language that started out in the early history of the web as just like a way to make your cursor blink or something like that, right? And like now it turns out to be a really huge programming language. and people have tried to dethrone JavaScript because this is not how you would have designed a language necessarily from scratch. If you wanted to design like the language for the modern web, but in practice it's been hard to do so. I think it's too early to say whether we have that for whether EVM has that. But it's again like it's looking somewhat hard to dislodge in that category. That said, I'm not sure that necessarily benefits Ethereum any more than it benefits the other EVM chains. So I think that's again it might benefit Ethereum relative to non-EVM chains. So like Solana is one example. But yeah, again, I think it's one that's shared by a lot of the projects that are using that platform. Yeah, one more question before we move on.
Is Ethereum a competitor for EVM compatible layer?
Yeah, so Ethereum is an EVM compatible. The question is Ethereum an EVM compatible layer one? Is it a competitor? I mean, it depends on how you look at it. I think I would say yes. I'd say all these layer one platforms, the generalized smart contract platforms, in some sense, are competing for applications to be built on them, competing for users to use them. Certainly, the ones that are built on their own layer ones seem to be. So yeah, I would consider that. We can get back to. I don't want to run out of time. We can get back to any further questions on these at the end. But I want to talk a little about some of the open problems for layer one, because this is if you wanted to go out and build a layer one, and it's a very ambitious thing to do. But I wouldn't say it's too late to do anything. So if you want to, I would take a look at what are these problems, and I mentioned some that address scaling primarily. But there are other things that potentially could be addressed at this layer. And so if you're looking at problems to try to tackle, scaling is one. I think privacy, and this has been in the news a lot recently, is something that could be potentially very powerful if built in at the, and there may be reasons to build it in at, or some features that support it at the layer one layer. Different ways of being programmable, so different ways that people can write smart contracts on it. Like we said, EVM is one way. Solana takes another approach. The question is, are there other ways potentially to make it easier and make it easier, for example, for developers with Web2 experience, developers who use other languages to come in and write smart contracts. I think that's another tactic people can take. And finally, interoperability, figuring out how making it easier for people to move assets from one blockchain to another, or to run applications that were built for one blockchain on another. All right, so we can come back to. Yeah.
I have one more question for you before you move on to layer twos. So, what is the kind of founder that can build a layer one? What skills do they need? What's the profile they need? How much money would they need to raise to build an L1?
So what is the kind of founder that can build an L1? It's a great question. I think one common factor, if you look at people who have founders who have launched L1s, is the kind of resource gravity. This is not, it's a special kind of quality. I think people to build an L1, it's a very complicated operation, and it's one that requires a lot of coordination. It requires a lot of, again, like I said, requires applications to come to a chain that has no users yet. It requires users to come to a chain that has no applications yet. It requires you got to build a large company before you've even launched something. And this requires, I think, a founder. And I'm not sure exactly what it is in a person that gives them resource gravity. It's something more that you maybe observe, and you might observe about yourself or about someone you know. I don't think, for example, I would say I do not have resource gravity. I would not want to start an L1 if I was starting a platform business in Web3. But yeah, I would say because it's in some ways one of the most ambitious kinds of businesses you can try to build. I would say it's something that someone who, is able to really build a movement, to build a large company around something that is not really yet clear to anyone other than themselves. So I think that's been maybe a common trait among them. I would say I think L1s also, obviously, needless to say, it's a fairly technical thing to do for most L1s. It requires some good amount of technical or research skill, and generally a lot of these projects have started with people who are highly technical or have some innovation in the in consensus or cryptography or programming. But again, that's plausibly, I would put that even second next to the type of founder it takes to really go after that kind of big vision. So yeah, I'll be talking about layer twos. So a layer two platform. So this addresses, it can address maybe some of the other challenges of L1s, but really I would consider it as another scaling solution for L1s, but one that doesn't abandon the L1 that people were building on previously. And so it's maybe slightly easier, although still quite hard from a go-to-market perspective. So an L2 is a platform that inherits the security, ideally inherits the security of some other L1. And so if you build an L2 on, say, Ethereum, your L2 should be as secure as Ethereum and be able to interoperate securely with other applications on Ethereum, although with potentially a little more friction. But it should not be strictly limited by the scaling constraints of Ethereum. It should be able to scale to have slightly cheaper transactions or slightly higher throughput. So the most popular L2 architecture these days in new projects, and the one that I'll be talking about is called a rollup. So in a rollup, it is normally, if I wanted to say execute the entirety of a block if I wanted to launch a new blockchain, typically if I want to just run that blockchain on top of Ethereum, I could just put the whole block there, run it in a smart contract, and basically test it, like, what are the results if I were to run all the transactions in this block, and then just like spit out the answer. And that would allow me to have an L2 on Ethereum. It would be able to, people would be able to deposit into that from Ethereum and withdraw from it. But I wouldn't get any real scaling gains from that, because you still have to do all the same computation as you would if it were on the actual L1 itself. So what a rollup does, it will post all the data. And for complicated reasons, you do need to post like all the data generally to the L1 for this to be secure, but it won't actually execute any of the logic on that in your block under normal circumstances. It basically gets to skip that, and it does it by proving in some more efficient way than just running the whole thing, proving what the result of that execution would have been. So a couple of methods people use for proving this. One that I'll talk about in a second is optimistic rollups, and that's one where I'll basically just, someone says this is what this block would do, and then anyone can challenge me, and I put down some money. Anyone can challenge me, and then we'll test it out. And if I was lying, they take my money. We test it, and they take money. But normally nobody challenges me, and then we know what was in the block. So that's what's called an optimistic rollup. It uses this challenge response game for security. And then the other major kind of rollup is a ZK rollup. That's one where you just use advanced cryptography to prove what this execution would have resulted in. But both of these, again, you're trying to make execution more efficient within the context of an L1, but people can build their own applications on top of this L2. So,
Dan, a quick question.
Yeah.
So are L2s only a thing for Ethereum?
No, so you could build an L2 on any general purpose L1 platform. I think we've seen it as most popular right now on Ethereum, in part because Ethereum is the place where you'll hit these scaling bottlenecks most abruptly, and it's where, again, a lot of the users are, and it's easiest to grab some of that network effects. I think a lot of other chains potentially may end up using L2s if they, as part of their scaling roadmap, once they start hitting these same constraints. So here I'm talking about a couple projects that have taken this optimistic rollup approach. And Dawn just told me about her project, or student's project called Specular, which is yet another optimistic rollup, and one that takes an interesting approach. But what these projects have in common is they're optimistic rollups. They work, like I said, with this challenge response game, and they happen to be built on Ethereum and are meant to be provide an equivalent experience to the EVM. So any application that you write for Ethereum with some caveats should work on these if deployed to one of these rollups. So the problem that they're solving, yet again, high transaction fees. And then their differentiator from what I'd say is a lot of other rollups that take different approaches that don't provide EVM equivalents is it does make it easier for developers and users and infrastructure to port over. Because it's another EVM chain, and then again, like these often are people who are using Ethereum or applications who are using Ethereum because this thing is built on top of Ethereum. It's convenient for them to be able to move over to it. Their customer, like L1s, they're going after both the applications and the users. With these platforms, typically they're going after ones that are already on Ethereum, or we're thinking of building on Ethereum, or care about users who are on Ethereum. Because again, it's easy to move, relatively easy to move assets between these, between L1 and L2. And their moat, as with L1s, is if you have a lot of applications and users on your rollup, that's where other users and applications will want to be. It's potentially a slightly weaker network effect in this case, because again, you can always go back. You're relying on the same L1. People can go back to the L1. There's easy interoperability between them, but it's still, I would say, I think quite potent, which is why this has been another area which is considered a very popular place to build, and potentially a big prize. And then similarly, the business model here is transaction fees that users are paying to transact on it. So some of the open problems in layer 2, I think we haven't come close to reaching really the efficiency frontier of making these transactions as cheap as possible while still inheriting the security of the base chain. And then I think for there's also a lot to be done in programmability, especially for ZK rollups. So there are some ZK rollups out there that use this other technique with the fancy cryptography. To date, none of them provide what we would consider EVM equivalent. So you can just it's just really simple to port your Ethereum application over to that. You have to generally do some more development work, and that can be a friction. I think one goal that a lot of projects have is trying to address that problem and make it at least either EVM equivalent or make it at least easily programmable, like the L1. And then another is interoperability. And again, I think there's just a lot to be done in terms of making it seamless to move from one L2 to the L1 or back and forth, or to move between different L2s on the same L1. Any questions on L2?
So Dan, going back real quick. So you had, as your example, you had Optimism. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more of the story behind Optimism. Like, who founded Optimism? Why did they found it? How long did it take? Like, give us the storyline so people can understand what goes into building a startup like this.
Absolutely. So when I told the story before about people who recognized that Ethereum would ultimately hit a scaling bottleneck and then started working on this before the scaling bottleneck had been hit, Optimism is the type of team that I had in mind there. So it was a team of people who had been working on Ethereum scaling for a while. It's since 2017, 2018. And actually, so the Optimism team I got to know in early 2018, and some of the founders there were Jane, Carl, and Ben, who is still at the company. And I should disclose here that we're invested in Optimism, and I consider them personal friends. But they've been working on basically different approaches to scale Ethereum. And so they actually started a nonprofit in 2019 called Plasma Group, which is trying to scale to use this different approach to L2 scaling called Plasma. And I would have considered myself, I think, a Plasma researcher in 2018. We were all spending a lot of 2018 and 2019 just like working on different kinds of plasma. And it's interesting. I mean, it's a research area that I think does not exist anymore because it went nowhere. Plasma is not a real thing. It's never going to happen. But what it did produce was I think a lot of people who thought a lot about these problems and landed on along at the same time as some others in the space, the solution of doing it as a rollup. So this really has been a trial and error process of figuring out what the ideal L2 architecture is. And then people who, again, started working on this and really committed themselves to it before they actually knew what the ultimate architecture was going to be, or what the right one was going to be. But yeah, so then they ended up doing this as a nonprofit in 2019 until late 2019 when they incorporated it as a company. And again, Paradigm, we invested in them. But yeah, and I think that's a case where you sort of just bop around in the right circles and bang your head against the right problems for a while. And even if what was inevitably what you're working on originally was not necessarily on the right track, it leads you to ultimately the interesting solution. So that was one of the lessons I took from them. I think they're some of the most persistent people that I know. And yeah, I think that's with L2s as well. There's still quite a lot of just grit that's needed, and some of that resource gravity, and some grit that's needed to really make this actually work. Cool. So now talk a little about infrastructure, and this is a very broad category. And I've talked about some of the kinds of infrastructure, but really, like a lot of things, anything that's really like B2B in crypto, you might consider infrastructure in one sense or another. So here are some of the examples up there. And this is just because what is, the layer one in itself, a layer one blockchain, it provides like this very minimal set of consensus service on top of it provides this very minimal like transaction execution service on top of this very minimal consensus service that it is providing. And there's just a lot of other things that need to be done for someone to be able to actually use a blockchain, for someone to build an application on a blockchain. You need to have like easy ways to access the data from it. So that's data infrastructures. You need it to be painless for somebody to run a node and get the data, get live data from it and send transactions to it. So that's where node infrastructure companies like Alchemy and Pura come in, as well as some of the mempool companies, which I would love to talk more about if anyone's interested in talking after, but it's a little out of scope, like Flashbots. And Blocks around and Block Native, you need tooling for developers to be able to use this, and so a lot has been built up around that here. And you need people to be able to, ordinary people to be able to use this, and so you need to have wallets, you need to have custody and key management, including the company I'll be talking about next. And all this whole ecosystem was basically built up around. And a lot of these are focused on Ethereum, but I think really any successful L1 needs a successful infrastructure ecosystem, and there's just a lot of opportunity there. And so one approach which I think could be a way to find a good business, a good niche to fit into, is to look at the Ethereum ecosystem. Rather look at a new ecosystem that you're excited about. Look at something that you think this L1 that you see. Go out there, find an L1 that you think is going to be successful. Then look at its ecosystem and say, what's missing here? And you can look at Ethereum as a guide and say, here are all the companies that are doing this for Ethereum. Could I build something in order to basically provide this service on this chain? And so one example there, is I think Phantom, another paradigm. A lot of these are paradigm investments, but Phantom was, they wanted to build a wallet. There are a lot of wallets on Ethereum, but as of yet, there weren't really any successful wallets on Solana. So they actually went out and basically took a calculated risk that Solana was going to be a major ecosystem. And I think that ended up paying off for them, and they became the most popular wallet on Solana. But I think that that requires often having some vision in terms of, I see that this L1 is going to be really successful, and so I'm willing to build something in that ecosystem. So the company I'll be talking,
Dan, a quick question before you move on to the case study. So it seems like from the examples you gave of all the infrastructure companies, the vast majority of them seem to deal with Ethereum, and very few of them seem to be focused on Bitcoin, even though Bitcoin ostensibly is like really big. Why is that?
Yeah, I mean, that's putting me in a tough spot. I think so. There's some extent to which Bitcoin, a major virtue of Bitcoin, is that it's, and I don't know how many people here, whenever I talk to young people, often they're just like, oh, Bitcoin, that thing. But I used to be a Bitcoiner, and I would say, a virtue of Bitcoin is that it really is trying to be very simple and trying not to do too much. And so that means that often I think it makes the Bitcoin ecosystem very difficult to attack in certain social senses. It means there's sort of a purity to what's going on in Bitcoin that makes it hard to subvert the core process, but it also makes it very frustrating to try to build applications on top of it. And in fact, again, for some I think legitimate reasons, people often don't want applications to be built on top of the Bitcoin blockchain itself. And so it can be a difficult. It can be sort of difficult to build applications on it, and then just a lot less infrastructure is needed for what it does support. I think the core Bitcoin software and the software people have built in the open source software does this job very well. And that's just primarily, again, to manage custody and payments with Bitcoin. And some of these infrastructure companies, by the way, do support Bitcoin, and Bitcoin custody, including, I believe, Fireblocks. But again, I think it just hasn't produced as many big businesses built on top of it, in part because its focus has been very tight. Is that the answer you were looking for?
I wasn't looking for a particular answer, just wanted your perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So again, I think it's the fact that I don't have that this is largely Ethereum based, I think is partly because I'm trying to pick representative examples. But there are a lot of these companies I know building similar things on other chains. And again, I think that it is a very, if you are confident about a particular L1, that could be a very promising way to get to start building a business on it. is start looking at these infrastructure companies and ideas. So Fireblocks is the next time I'll be talking about. So this is it's sort of a wallet for institutions is maybe the simplest way that you could think about it. And I would say that the pain point that it's really addressing is that institutions, banks, big corporate companies, don't want to deal with private keys. They don't want to have a MetaMask wallet. They don't even want to have a hardware wallet. Like they would like a login that they go in and that has normal security policies. They would like to have permissions for different users that they can revoke and add and change. They want these things that they're accustomed to in authentication, but they want it in a secure way for crypto assets and crypto securing private keys that control crypto. So Fireblocks is a company that serves this need, and so their key differentiator, I think, from here I'm talking about differentiator from other companies that serve custodians that serve crypto, that's their businesses that want to hold crypto, is that they allow you to do really essentially anything you can do with a private key you can do with through Fireblocks, including these complex like DeFi interactions, and that allows these big businesses to not just like hold crypto like they might at a Coinbase or an Anchorage, these big custodians, but to actually be able to use it, or at least try out using it. And so again, it's going after these big institutional crypto users that this is like a very like B2B business model, and but it's going after people and potentially much like slower sales cycle. So I think if you're thinking about like what kind of founder do I need to be to start something like a Fireblocks, you have to be comfortable going in and doing potentially a long sales cycle, getting big companies up to sort of holding their hand as they start work through all the compliance and other issues with trying to hold crypto. But again, the payoff there is I think you can build quite a lot of trust with the industry, and I think that can be a potential moat. And then another interesting moat, and this was when I first heard about Fireblocks. One of my colleagues had heard about it from a portfolio company of ours, and I think the exciting thing about Fireblocks is that this portfolio company said basically, there's basically like no amount of money we wouldn't pay for it. I don't think they said it like that, but if you imagine metaphorically like that, because like it's just built directly into all of our operations, and it would be hard to tear it out. That's like a good thing for a B2B company, and part of it, one of these things that it supports is also some network effects with it, which is there's a settlement network that basically allows people to transfer. If you're transferring from one Fireblocks user to another Fireblocks user, you can transfer over this rather than going like putting in and pasting in a wallet. You can paste in like their Fireblocks address. Basically, I would maybe think about it that way. This again here is an example of of a B2B SaaS company, effectively as a software as a service company in crypto. And yeah, again, I think for if you're a certain kind of founder, this is the sort of thing you might be very excited about.
Can you tell us a bit about who the founders are and why they decided to build Fireblocks?
Haseeb told me to do this one as an example, and I don't know.
Wait, I
don't know the founders. I don't know. I don't want to be going out doing too many stories, but I know the founders a little, but not very well. I'd say so they're from Israel. Companies based in Israel, and include some great cryptographers. And there they had, it is a B2B business, but it also has like very deep tech. And so people who were able to. This is another, I think, really, really interesting model for companies. If you can marry like very practical like business hustle and ability to go out and do and pound the pavement and do long sales cycles with a really strong like cryptographic or technical innovation, I think that can be very powerful. So yeah, again, I don't know too much about them, but I do respect their cryptography a lot.
So they're Israeli and they're cryptographers. This is what I got from you. Okay, great.
I don't have a lot of anecdotes about them now.
Perfect. Nailed it.
Yep. So on infrastructure, when you're looking for a problem out here, I think there's a few big ones. And again, these are kind of like broad categories, and for any particular thing, you might see instances of this. But one problem is user experience. This still is, despite I think a lot of effort that's been made over the past 5 years, it's still very difficult for ordinary people to be able to use Web3 applications, or for ordinary businesses to be able to use Web3. And so trying to make that painless and make it easy for people to onboard, I think will be for a very long time a good business model, or sorry, not a good business, a good problem to be addressing. Decentralization, I think a lot of these companies that are listed there have been accused of being single points of failure in the operation of these or usage of these crypto networks. And so figuring out like how do we actually prevent that in a way that, again, could harm a lot of what we like about or are excited about in layer 1 blockchains. How do we avoid that? Again, while still ideally building a strong business on it. And then finally, I think there's a large class of businesses or types of infrastructure that have historically, both in Web2 and Web3, been hard to monetize. And one example is open source software. I think especially open source developer tooling has been typically fairly hard to monetize. Like one reason is if it's open source software, often it can be forked to use by anyone. Another reason is that developers just love writing tools. Like they love it, they'll do it for free, they'll pay to do it. And so your competition is people who just are excited to basically build the software. So I think it can be hard. People have experimented with, and I'm not sure we have a result yet, but with figuring out, does Web3 add something here? Like, is there a way we could fund open source or make it profitable? Without make stuff like building developer tools more profitable. Make a real business model for it that Web3 uniquely enables. And I think people have tried this, just like, oh, just launch a token and call it the name of your developer tool. But I think trying to find something maybe a little more sustainable than that. And something that really actually like captures value from the usage of it, I think would be really cool. Any questions on infrastructure? Yes.
So for like Fireblocks, if you're logging in with like username password, like that, is that data then centralized?
I'm sorry, with Fireblocks, the question is, if you're using Fireblocks, is the data centralized?
If you're like logging in with like username password, are you not like creating?
Yeah, I see. Yeah, the question is if you're logging in with like a username and password on a platform like Fireblocks, is that centralized? So what Fireblocks offers actually is a multi-party computation-based wallet. So and this can work. It can look a lot of different ways. But one way is you basically have one private key, or you control one private key. Fireblocks company controls another. Maybe there's one in secure hardware somewhere. And so it's sort of requires multiple people actually acting at the same time to move stuff. Again, that's like this. It is a custodial solution. Generally, the design of Fireblocks, it isn't about trying to have like a completely 100% like everything would be fine if this entire company disappeared model. It's more about having something that is usable by but it still keeps the flexibility of having your own private key. Cool. So next one I'll talk about is centralized finance. So this is another one that I don't typically touch this area in my research or in the investments that I work with. But it does, I think it's very obviously important for the space. So centralized finance, I'd say anything where you are, again, depositing crypto and using it custodially and trading it or borrowing against it or using leverage with it. And then so exchanges for both spot and leverage or perps, derivatives. On and off ramps, so ways to just get money in and out of the entire crypto system, and custodians. So that's just again, the centralized parties that are willing to hold your crypto and keep it safe. Sorry, was there a question?
Oh, yeah, sorry, I was just going back to the previous slide. Question on using stablecoin. We're a little bit different into stressing. Do you think that the problem lies on the threshold of current users in the Web2 world, like using the Web3 arena, or do you think the problem lies in that there's no application that actually utilizes the infrastructure to correctly capture the user value, provide the value to Web3 users?
Yeah. So the question is to rephrase, is the reason there's no like painless experience that nobody's actually using Web2 correctly or Web3 correctly, or there's no real reason to use Web3, or?
Yeah, probably.
I mean, I think there's some amount where you have to take a leap of faith here in building some of these things where, yeah, I mean, I think like right now, I would say a lot of attempts at integrating Web3 into Web2 businesses have been kind of cringe. I think like a lot of these attempts are, it's like, well, what, you shouldn't be using a blockchain, right? Or certainly you shouldn't be doing it the way that you're doing it, or this is pointless, like it's not actually decentralized, you're not actually taking advantage of this. I think in many cases, those compromises, or at least the argument would be a lot of those compromises that Web2 businesses make when trying to integrate Web3 are because they're not willing to sacrifice user experience as much as we are, like as much as like Web3 people would like to. And again, I think Web3 people often also make tremendous compromises of decentralization for user experience as well. So it's not, I think this is generally true. But the idea is that if you could make it as painless to actually do things in a decentralized way, then people would, again, you could potentially use that infrastructure more easily. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Sorry. Yeah. I'm sorry. Sorry, could you repeat that?
What is the work done on abstracting like what is the MetaMask that one of these other wallets there are used by someone who's not using?
Right. So, yes, so I think the question is, what is work being done on abstracting away some of the complexities for people, for non-technical people using a wallet like MetaMask? Yeah, I mean, I think that's like basically it's the hard work of product building. I wish I had there's not really a simple answer for it. I think like, yeah, if you had, here's a wallet that's really painless to use, it's like as painless to use as Apple Pay, then I think like people, that would be a big, potentially a really huge business. And I think part of the challenge is just like, it actually takes quite a lot of work to make a product that's seamless. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, I'm looking for more on the industry.
Are there projects working on it? Oh yeah, I mean, there are a lot of projects working on wallets and working on making wallets more user friendly. I don't want to call it necessarily too many of them, but again, I think it's a fairly people know about this problem, and yeah, I think there's a lot of people trying to build businesses on what if using Web3 wallets didn't suck.
What are some other places that can get abstracted?
Oh, other places other than wallets. I mean, I think generally the experience of using any application where you have to interact with the chain a lot. Like if you want to maybe I'm still talking about wallets a little bit, but like if you have to like actually sign a transaction every time you click on something, like that's terrible. I think there's a lot of user experience problems that come from just lower in the stack. So obviously like high latency on transactions is a user experience problem. High fees on transactions is a user experience problem. I'm thinking about this more, like there's if you look, all of Web3 is pain. And so if you just sort of look anywhere in Web3, you will see pain. And this is I think that the name of that pain. Sorry, I'm probably not giving you a visually specific example, but I think it's because it's almost like all around us. At least it feels like that to me. But I'm happy to discuss more after to maybe dig in a little more if you're looking for a particular answer. Any other questions on infra? Cool. So centralized finance, I mentioned, it's people who hold your crypto for you and do stuff with it. So here I'm thinking about Coinbase is my like quintessential example of this kind of business, but there's a few others, and FTX and Binance are two of the biggest. And this is just a crypto exchange. Probably a lot of you have used one. The problem it's solving, I think, if if you were around in the early days of crypto, like crypto exchanges were super sketchy. Like half the time they would just steal your money. The other half of the time they would get hacked. And like even when they worked, you had to like wire your money to an address in Japan in order to and KYC over video in order to buy crypto. And yeah, again, like people, it was a massive burden. It's one reason why like a lot of early people just would like mine it themselves. And so when Coinbase started in 2012, I think it was just like, let's just be a non-sketchy place to actually use this. And it feels obvious in hindsight that this would be big, but I think it wasn't. And this is one of those examples of just, you see this invisible pain, or you see the pain that everybody is actually experiencing it, but people aren't really, or at least they're not taking the right tactics to try to solve it. And so, yeah, and their key differentiator, I think early on was just we never get hacked. And then in addition to that, they, I think, also took a very compliant strategy that allowed them to establish themselves really doing business in the United States. I mean, a lot of these other businesses have spent a lot of effort on compliance and just trying to be basically a trusted compliant place to be able to store and trade crypto for and as an on-ramp, as a place for somebody to actually get into the system. And so yeah, their business model typically is most of these businesses make money on trading fees. When people trade on their exchange, they take a cut of the trading. And trading fees is one of the most successful business models generally across crypto. If you have trading in your application, like that's a very good place to go looking for a business model, because you can potentially put a fee on that. Some of the open problems yeah.
A quick question. So who are the kinds of people who start exchanges or who should start exchanges?
Kind of people who should start exchanges. So I think with an exchange, it's a good question. I think if you're comfortable with a lot of your life being compliance, again, like I said, I used to be a lawyer. Like I do not enjoy interacting very much with the legal system. I try to set up my life so that I don't get in trouble or have to. I think some people have to, someone has to be bearing that burden for the space, and often I think it falls on exchanges to basically put a lot of work in to being compliant, to getting the right licenses, to having the right certifications. So I think that's a big part of building a centralized finance crypto business. And I think you have to be like really paranoid about security and really care about your users' security, I think, to be able to run a crypto exchange. And again, I think like that's true for maybe a lot of these. But it's just, again, like it's potentially like if people, it can be a slower moving business basically, then you have to move a little slower than potentially some of like building an infrastructure business, or in some senses a DeFi business.
So the examples you gave of the 3 CeFi businesses were Coinbase, FTX, and Binance. They are also, like, in their respective markets, they're like 3 of the largest companies in crypto. Why are the big exchanges the biggest companies in crypto? Like I said, I think trading fees is just one of the best business models that we found in all of Web3. So that's one reason, is there's a very strong business model around it. The other reason is that like the main use case, the most popular use case we have found for crypto is people buying and selling it. I think there's a lot you can say about that, but that's something that we know people want to do. They want to buy and sell crypto. A lot of other use cases for crypto are much more speculative. And so speculative is sort of a funny word to use in that context. But we're guessing that we can apply this technology to something. We know that people just like, there's something about people really want to buy Bitcoin and they really want to sell Bitcoin, and sometimes they want to do it, both of those, a lot in the same day, and you can just put a fee on it. So that's, and I think it's a very popular behavior. So for some of the open problems here, I think centralized finance, one of the places where they interface with the real world is they're the ones interacting often with institutions, along with some of the infrastructure companies. They're trying to get institutions comfortable using crypto, buying crypto, and so increasingly, I think some of those businesses are going after these institutional customers and trying to get them comfortable using or holding crypto. Another open problem, I think, is interoperability. So again,
you as a centralized business, you're interfacing with the traditional world. So you have to, you know how to get money in and out. Sometimes you have to get interact maybe in more complex ways with the legacy financial system. You also, I think in the future, a lot of these centralized finance businesses will interact a lot with DeFi, the category I'm going to be talking about next. And so figuring out how do we actually bridge that gap between them is a place where centralized finance, I think, has a lot to offer. And then finally, I think regulatory compliance, like I said, it can be a big slog up a long hill to get the right certifications to get to be recognized as compliant in certain jurisdictions, and just doing that all over the world in every state in the United States. Again, I think it's something, and convincing policymakers and regulators that like what you're doing is non-sketchy and should be allowed. I think there's a lot of work to be done there. Well, so final category I'll be talking about is decentralized finance. This is where I've spent a lot of time in my crypto career. But this is, I think a lot of you have probably heard a little about some of the applications in centralized finance. One reason is that it's often considered to be one of the easiest or quickest kinds of startups to build. In that, like you can sort of build a one of these projects like in your garage and launch it and potentially get quite a lot of money into it in a way that with most of these other categories, I think is a lot harder to do. And it's because of the affordances allowed by the L1s and the L2s that we talked about, is because of the maturity of some of the infrastructure that you're actually able to do this. But it's also because, of course, of some of the inherent problems of crypto is like you actually, some of these things that you can do with decentralized finance, like build a decentralized exchange where you're not trusted to custody money. You're taking advantage of a core feature of programmable blockchain like Ethereum. So these are some of the categories. I can go into more depth on them, but I want to talk again because I think we're I don't want to go too long a time. I want to leave more time for questions. Talk about one example of this, and one that I think is a good example of how crypto makes it easy to build these applications in your garage, and that's decentralized exchange. And so I mentioned a few decentralized exchanges here. You may have heard of Uniswap, Curve, and SushiSwap. So these are exchanges, or rather, they're protocols on the Ethereum blockchain, and in some cases on other blockchains as well. But they're all on Ethereum. And the idea is it's a decentralized protocol where you keep your money. If you're trading on this protocol, you keep your money until when you actually trade on it. So if you're trading ETH for USDC, you have your ETH, and then you send it in, you immediately get USDC, and there's no way for the exchange to steal your money. So it's non-custodial. It also liquidity providers. If you're basically like making a market in one of these pairs, if you're trying to sell assets or provide liquidity on this, similarly, it's non-custodial, assuming there's no bug in the contract. And this is I think one of the most purest examples of how crypto makes it easy to build this thing in a way where you don't even have to be trusted. So you don't have to build up an entire security infrastructure. You don't have to be tremendously careful with everybody's money because you're not actually custodying any of the money at all. You just have to write a smart contract that's really, really good. And if you do it just once, and it can be, then that problem is basically taken care of for you by the layer one in the infrastructure. So a story around this is Uniswap, which is again, another disclosure, is a paradigm investment. So Uniswap, I got to meet Hayden, the founder of Uniswap, through Carl, the founder of Optimism, one of the previous companies that I talked about. And Hayden at the time he'd been laid off from his job as a mechanical engineer and had never written a program before. He wasn't a software engineer. He'd never written a line of code before in his life. And Carl suggested to him, here's this idea that Vitalik wrote a blog comment about how you could build a decentralized exchange on top of Ethereum. Because at the time, this was early 2018, there weren't a lot of applications live on Ethereum. And so this was one example of something you could. I think that conversation might have happened in the end of 2017. So Hayden taught himself to code, and over the next year or so built this application. It's only, I think the original Uniswap v1, I think it was only maybe 200 or 300 lines of code. The core smart contract for this this application. Deployed it, wrote also, and with some help, built a front end for it, and launched this on the Ethereum blockchain. And like this was, very like a shoestring budget. I think you got a $50,000 grant from the Ethereum Foundation, and another one to support another $50,000 grant to get the smart contract audited. But primarily, basically, that was about it in terms of actual funding for this idea. Was able to build this application that now, after a few more iterations, is the largest decentralized exchange in crypto. And this is something that, again, like it's remarkable. You can I think this is one of the few places, decentralized finance, we really can just build a major company, a major application just started out in your garage. You don't actually have to go raise money before launching this. And like or trying it out. I think that makes it very powerful. People can really just try things out using all the other infrastructure. But yeah, I think so. So this is Hesi was asking about what type of founder to do this here. I think if you're a move fast and break things founder, I would say definitely look at DeFi, but then also learn not to break things, because DeFi gets broken a lot. DeFi gets broken a lot, and you are because if it happens really fast, right? I've seen this happen to people. You launch you have an idea, you launch it, you get suddenly hundreds of millions of dollars. Maybe you create a token and like pay people to make up a token out of thin air, and you pay people to come use your thing. This is what I was talking about before in yield farming. You make up a token out of thin air, you pay people to come use this application that you just wrote in your basement. And suddenly it has hundreds of millions of dollars in it, maybe over $1 billion in it. I think that it can be thrilling. It also, I think, if you're sane, it can be very stressful, and you can get to that point very quickly without realizing it with DeFi. It almost moves, I think, too fast. So I would say just try to, you still want to like definitely be running through brick walls and driving through this, but it's an area where you may not realize the responsibilities that you're actually taking on in a sense because it's so easy to do. It's just, I just click and deploy. But of course, like all this is real people's money, and a lot of these cases, I mean, I think you have to be careful when writing these smart contracts. So like every smart contract, like I don't really trust smart contracts. I think they're sort of guilty until proven innocent. But some of these, like for more battle tested ones, again, I think like we have some confidence in it. But yeah, DeFi, point being, it can be really, really too easy, maybe, but really easy to launch something in DeFi and try it out. And again, just be careful with that power. So some of the, like I mentioned, security is one of the open problems in decentralized finance. User experience, in my view, decentralized exchange should be easier than centralized exchange. If you're using crypto already, it's hard for you, it's annoying, it's inconvenient for you to go deposit your money in a centralized exchange, trade it for something else, and like come back out onto Ethereum to do stuff. So there's this core like user experience benefit that comes from this. And I think generally, like a lot of people have found this that I think trading on Uniswap is or some of these other platforms can be easier in some cases than trading on custodial exchanges. But I think we really need to lean into those advantages and improve the user experience. It still has quite a lot of pain, as I was mentioning before. Efficiency, I think one of the big disadvantages that decentralized exchange has right now is that it does cost a lot more in terms of transaction costs. You pay Ethereum transaction costs sometimes, it can be like $10 plus to do a trade. I think these days on a decentralized exchange, that's a lot of just overhead. If you're trading, I think reducing those transaction costs, whether by scaling the blockchain or by finding other solutions, I think is a big open problem. And if you can do that, if you make trades cheaper, I think that's a really interesting, or make DeFi interactions cheaper, I think it's a really interesting business to build. Like security, like I said, and there's another area where you may potentially build a whole business around solving the security problem. Around I found a way to either make DeFi more secure, or maybe protect people who are using DeFi, whether through insurance or something like that. Taking advantage of the fact that it is right now incredibly insecure very often. And finally, regulatory clarity. I think one of the big challenges in DeFi often is it's so far not entirely clear what in DeFi is regulated by whom and how. And so that's something, again, like it may not be as much proactive, like spending time trying to figure out compliance on the front end. I think if you don't think about compliance and your regulatory approach, and like be serious about that as well, eventually that potentially catches up with you. So a lot of these areas, again, like it's almost about like which problems you have to address first. And here in DeFi, again, like a lot of these things are still there, even if you can sort of barrel ahead early on without thinking about it. Well, so those are the areas I wanted to cover. Any other questions?
So quick question I have for you, Dan. So you are very well known for your contributions personally to Uniswap, and your particularly on Uniswap v3, which is the newest iteration of Uniswap. Uniswap is by far the most successful on-chain decentralized exchange. What would you say are like how much more is there to go in decentralized trading? You said before, trading seems to be the best business model everywhere, whether in centralized finance or in decentralized finance. How much more do you think there is to go in the world of trading in DeFi?
How much further, as in how much innovation is there left to be done?
Correct.
In how we do decentralized trading? Yeah, I would say, yeah, I think there's quite a lot. And I can name some of the areas where I think decentralized, I'm happy to zoom in on decentralized exchange. Because yeah, this is one where I think there's a lot of potential business to be built. If you're thinking about building a business in decentralized exchange, I hope you don't, because then I'll have to crush you. But yeah, I think it's good. It's good for people to be doing this research and to be pushing the space forward. I'm always curious to see what people come up with in terms of solving some of these problems. So some of the boundaries I think right now in current research are how I think it could be improved. So one is around the intersection between decentralized exchange and miner extractable value, or MEV. And again, I didn't get into the details of like what MEV is on this call, but basically, it's so. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to explain it exactly just in this parenthetical in an answer to a question, but let me put it this way. So on Uniswap v3, 20% of trades, over 20% of trades executed a worse price than they would have at the beginning of the block if they'd been included as the first trade in the block that they were included in. And only 1% executed a better price than that. And I think this is in one way or another, I think a consequence of exactly how the exchange is designed and how the blockchain is designed. And I think trying to solve that problem, and I've given a couple of recent talks on it. You can check out a talk called Uniswap v3 or How We Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Concentrated Liquidity. Talked about this particular problem, of this problem of slippage. And I think it is trying to figure out, can we actually improve user execution there? So that's one area. So getting users better execution. I think, like I mentioned, reducing transaction costs is just a long way to go on reducing transaction costs. Hopefully some of that comes from the L1 or the L2. But I think probably some will also have to come from working on the design of the decentralized exchange. So reducing value loss to miner extractable value, reducing transaction costs. And then I think, cross between centralized exchange and decentralized exchange trading, being able to actually access liquidity or assets that are in the other, I think is interesting. As is cross-chain trading between one L1 and another L1, or trading between an L1 and an L2. So I think a lot of these are areas where I hope to see a lot of people doing research on this, and then hopefully I will get to crush them. Other questions? Yes.
What's kind of your thinking, because you're, what we should in this space is to talk on aggregated DEXs and like DEXs in general, so like 1inch, 0x, and all those things, and then the Uniswap. Like, how do you see those two competing in the future? Are they like fierce competitors? How do you see like it kind of evolving towards?
Yeah. Questions about how I see aggregators, how I see DEX aggregators evolving, and the competition between DEX aggregators and decentralized exchanges themselves. Yeah, I think it's a really important question, because ultimately everyone is competing to provide ideally, if the market is working, everyone's competing to provide the best execution. They're competing for order flow. They're competing for people want to trade an asset, and people want to compete to provide better execution for it. And I think aggregators right now are like one of the ways that people are trying to find better execution for assets. So I think it's a real threat potentially certainly to a lazy DEX that thinks that it can just rely on everyone always trading directly on it, no matter what price they're getting. And I think it's one of the things that drives DEXs will drive some innovation with and around DEXs. But yeah, I don't want to give away too much of how I think about this particular problem. But yeah, I think it's a really important one. Haseeb, you're deep into aggregators and DEXs. Do you have any thoughts on the question?
So I didn't hear the full question. What was the full question?
I think the basic question was, how do you see the competition between aggregators and decentralized exchanges playing out?
So, I mean, if you look at the way that traditional finance works, in traditional finance, there's this law or this regulation called NBBO, which stands for National Best Bid or Order, which basically means that any broker that is routing, let's say you want to buy some stock, like you're on Robinhood or something, the brokerage is mandated by law to give you the best price on every single exchange in the US. So it has to check all of them simultaneously because they're all digital, so it's pretty straightforward to do. And so there's sort of this enforced, this mandated legal optimality that you have to give the customer the best possible price if you're trying at least the basics. Now, most of the time when you're trading on a retail exchange, actually you'll be getting better execution than what you'd be getting looking at the very best exchange, because if you're a retail user, you very often are exactly the kind of person that a high frequency trading firm or a market maker wants to trade against. So oftentimes if you're trading on Robinhood, you'll be actually getting better prices than you could get actually looking at the best possible bid on an exchange. I think that is probably a good vision of what the end state looks like, is that when you have totally open competition, you will just get more and more price efficiency and more competition to try to give the user the absolute best possible price. Aggregators, so what aggregators do is they look at all of the platforms. They look at Uniswap, they look at SushiSwap, they look at blah, 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 all the other things that Dan was alluding to as on-chain sources of liquidity. And they try to get you the best possible price across everything. And sometimes what they'll even do is they'll split up your order to make sure that half your order gets executed here, half your order gets executed there, because it gives you even better price improvement. In the long run, it seems pretty inevitable to me, because all this stuff is software and all because it's all open, that will just be the default. You'll just interact with something that will figure out the smartest way to execute your trades across all these different platforms. The same way that today, when I'm looking at flights, I go to Google Flights, right? I don't go to, my favorite, airline and check what their flights are. I just say, well, look, I'm okay with taking any airline provided that it's like not totally terrible or that the timing isn't awful or the prices aren't crazy. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done for aggregators to be really good, to not, like right now they have, a lot of aggregators have high failure rates. They don't totally solve the MEV problem. There's still, I think, a lot of issues around user experience for aggregators. So I think there's still a lot of improvement to be done. And it's a moving target, because more and more people are doing trading across multiple different applications. So they're doing it across different blockchains. They might be doing it on a layer 2 instead of on a layer 1. So I think aggregators still have a lot of room to improve, much like the layer 1s, the DeFi applications that live on layer 1 as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. One more thing I'll mention. I do think decentralized exchanges on chain do have one advantage, which is the ability to atomically execute trades on them with other exchanges. And this is something that aggregators can take advantage of. But in some sense, this is the ultimate co-location, right? Is the ability to have trades that atomically execute on multiple decentralized exchanges on chain, or that execute on atomically on chain with other applications that are doing something with that money. And so I think that's part of where I think some of the advantages that like native decentralized exchanges might have over off-chain aggregators. But I generally think off-chain RFQ aggregators, these other kinds of services are going to be increasingly important. And again, I think Haseeb was early to this thought, certainly. And I'll credit him with that. Yes.
Well, thanks for talking about me, Dan. I understand it. I was wondering what your thoughts on the XRP ledger are.
The question is what my thoughts are on the XRP ledger.
Yeah.
I do not have a lot of thoughts on the XRP ledger.
What about Zinfin?
Sorry?
Zinfin, in terms of being a solution between decentralized and centralized finance.
Zinfin. How do you spell that?
XINFIN.
Is that like an XRP thing?
No, it's compliant with a lot of the international regulations, but the
I haven't heard of Zinfin. My thought on Ripple, I actually was a big fan of a technology that came out of Ripple Labs a few years ago called Interledger that they were supporting. I think, and I gave a talk called HTLC is considered harmful a few years ago about why I thought this technology for a certain kind of, I don't want to get too much into details, but why I thought this technology was actually better than something that Lightning, the people over working on the Lightning network and Bitcoin land were using for how they did a particular thing. Unfortunately, I'm not sure Ripple is actively working on Interledger anymore, or it seems like it's definitely taken a bit of a backseat. So I haven't been as close to have followed what they've been doing as close since then. Yes. Yes. Sorry.
I was wondering, like you mentioned earlier, that a lot of the web so far have been anything, but I was wondering, like, how you think they can become less.
Right. The question is, if a lot of Web 2, Web 3 integrations have been cringe to date, how do they become less cringe? I mean, I think part of it might be if we are in a bear market. Bear market integrations are in some sense maybe less cringe than bull ones. You maybe have a slightly higher bar and less madness. You need some amount of madness for any startup or for any interesting venture. But I think, yeah, I think some of the pressure, maybe we may start to see some better ideas coming out, or some of the ideas be a little bit more sane around that. I don't know specific. I'm not sure I have specific thoughts. I do think like a lot of people in Web 2 are thinking right now very hard about this and in a very serious way. And I think, yeah, again, like I think they're a lot smarter than me and better at this. Again, I don't mean by saying a lot of these are cringe. I don't mean to be, yeah, sort of like discouraging people from trying out these experiments. I think it's just sort of it's a statement of fact that they manage to kind of alienate the Web 2 people without really appealing to the Web 3 people. And so having one that like really actually is at the intersection, I think would be in the sweet spot there, and manages to not offend both at least. I think would be, yeah. It's really often it's a cultural thing as well as just technological thing. Yeah, and sort of the sense people want the sense that you're not just pandering to them or not just trying to make a quick buck off of the Web 3 space. Yes.
Just going outside of DeFi DAOs or centralized exchanges, how do you see blockchain as a technology that could be integrated into everyone's life in, I guess, 10 years, 20 years? How do you see the assets of this technology being actually creating values for the real life, other than outside of the trading, like gambling?
How do I see blockchain being integrated into real life outside of gambling in the long run? Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to say. I think there's certainly for me, I think the financial applications feel a lot more in focus than other applications. And I think partly if when I was talking about decentralized finance, that excitement you get from it, it isn't just about like, oh, you can make a lot of money from this, right? Or that it's about speculation. It's like, oh, this is something that just you wouldn't be able to build using existing technology. The fact that, again, like I think it happens to be the demand happens to be fueled a lot by what people like call speculation, I think has kind of distracted from that fact. But the core technology, I do think, has a lot of the thing people used to say, right? Like the key innovation is not Bitcoin; it's the underlying blockchain technology. No, but like I sort of mean it. That it makes sense for financial applications because if I have an asset and I give it to you, then I no longer have the asset, and so we're tracking. It sort of maps correctly to the concept. And again, I think that's intentional. Like that's the reason blockchains were invented, was to track a ledger. But I think that makes it, at least I have better line, what I'm saying here is I have better line of sight into, it just makes sense that financial assets should in some sense be programmable in this way. And then I think it stands to reason that like we actually have seen a lot more growth in decentralized approaches to this than we have in centralized approaches to doing blockchains for finance. So like despite a lot of trying, I used to work at a private blockchain company. I'm sort of giving my answer out of order here. But I would say I think ultimately it could see quite a lot of the financial system in the long run running on rails that are similar to to what blockchains look like today, at least in some meaningful sense. Yes.
What DeFi primitive do you think is missing?
What DeFi primitive do I think is missing? Missing as in, yeah, so as in someone should build it, or missing as in like people have built it and people don't seem to be using it yet? Okay, so someone should build it, maybe, yeah. It's a great question. I should have a better answer for it. I think, you know, like I'm trying to blank actually. It's funny because I think like, yeah, it hasn't really been my focus as much, like looking for primitives in DeFi anymore. In part because it feels like we are not making very good use of the primitives we have. And the primitives that we have are not, we haven't done them in the best way that we possibly could. And so I think to some extent, at least for example, like what Evm and I were saying about decentralized exchange, I think there's actually like a long rabbit hole to go down on making decentralized exchange work really well. You know what? Yeah, here's what I'll say. I think so. Yeah, so a lot of in terms of like trading, a lot and leverage and stablecoins, all that stuff. Like we've seen a lot of quote unquote innovation on those the past couple of years. All right, I'll say I think public goods funding would be one. I think seeing good mechanisms for people to come together and actually fund something that they all want to happen, but nobody's willing to like individually put up the money for. And this is something that's been a big focus of Vitalik's. It's been a big focus of a lot of projects like Gitcoin, which Paradigm invested in. Been a focus of people in the space. We haven't really nailed this yet, I think. And it's important not just because like, oh, it's a public goods like charity. It's it's doing good stuff. I think the public goods problem is really just it's a matter of monetizing. If I like were to produce say like a developer tool, right? How would I monetize it? Really, the developer tool is just useful to anybody, and anybody can access it and use it without paying me anything. And that's that's what makes it a public good. I can't actually stop people if I at least put it out and make it as usable as possible. That involves me basically giving up the right to stop people from using it, and that makes it impossible to monetize. That's a public good by sort of the economic definition of the word. And capturing value from that is trying to solve the public goods problem. And so trying to find a way to basically capture value from the public goods that one produces is, I think, it's a very practical businessy problem, and we haven't really figured it out. And yeah, I think we have a lot of DAOs, we have a lot of attempts at doing decentralized governance or decentralized funding of things, of different ecosystems. I think it's very hard to do. And if we had a really good, just what I want is a funnel, and anyone, you can just pour money into the funnel, and then just like good stuff comes out of the bottom. Because there's a lot of money that is waiting on the sidelines basically to just be given away. They would love to give it away as long as it helps basically the right ecosystem, right? There's billions of dollars in DAOs and foundations and in venture funding that would love to basically just put in money, even if you don't get direct ownership from putting in this money, but it just like gets used for useful things that help this ecosystem because you're invested in the ecosystem, you care, or you're part of the ecosystem. And I think if you had a reliable mechanism for that, you would unlock quite a lot of value. So yeah, so that's the primitive. It's not very primitive. It's a DeFi advanced, but that's what I've got. Yes. So yeah. My eyes are crossed. I'm never looking the right way.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for the talk. And I'm just curious from like a paradigm perspective, from all these different categories, like L1, L2, infrastructure, DeFi, where you guys investing, do you see trends for the next 3 years? Areas that you're particularly interested in?
The question is areas that Paradigm is looking at for investors that we're particularly interested in the next couple of years. I mean, just I speak better to like what I personally have looked at and tend to spend time looking at. I think it's a lot of the ones in the categories that we've talked about here. I think bear markets, if that's where we're in, I don't know, it doesn't mean anything. But drawdowns, whatever it is, quieter times can be a good time to, I think, like take a deep look at infrastructure and like really try to build things properly or invest in building things properly. And so I think that's one. I think certainly like infrastructure has taken up and related things around L1 and L2 has taken up a lot of my mental space recently, just because it feels like this. Yeah, like we can stop maybe putting out fires for a moment and like try to actually really, what is our next innovation that's going to bring us like 10x on that? So yeah, and do some of the hard work on it. So yeah, I think infrastructure is maybe one area, but generally we're always looking at essentially anything across the entire space, and we try not to be too opinionated on what kinds of startups are interesting to us. Yes.
Hi, my name is Tarek. I have a question about the private blockchains. So what's your take on this? Like, is the future for big banks like stocks use their own private blockchains? They are already doing this, or the future is more in public.
The question was about private blockchains and whether whether big banks like like JP Morgan ultimately will they be using things like private blockchains, these efforts toward building private permissioned blockchains, or whether they'll be using big open public blockchains like Ethereum. So I do think I used to work at a permissioned blockchain company, and this like Plasma Researcher, like permissioned blockchain company is sort of it's a dated thing to be. It doesn't really exist anymore. There may be a couple still out there, but it was a whole trend though, and it was big from 2015 to 2018 or so. But it turned out it's very hard to try to sell this kind of something like this, and it was way too early, I think, to try to sell something like this into big companies or banks. And they were interested in trying it because, of course, you want to try, it's a hot thing, blockchain, you want to try it out. But it wasn't really tied to their direct business use, and it just wasn't, the technology was not mature enough for it actually to address any of these real problems. People just had, I think, often a misunderstanding, and it wasn't entirely their fault, of what the technology actually did, what it was capable of, and why someone might want to use it. So I do think we've seen quite a lot more growth and development in public blockchains in the technology than we've seen in private blockchains, certainly. And I think ultimately that's probably the road it'll come from. It's going to be the technology developed for public open permissionless blockchains is ultimately what people will use for private blockchains. They'll use stuff like EVM or probably other platforms that are built on top of it, rather than it being a totally independent thing that was just built from the ground up. In much the same way, a lot of company intranets, basically they use IP, right? They use a lot of the same technology that the internet does. So yeah, I think there is some space, I think, in the future for permissioned blockchain. So I think it's a similar technology stack, is my guess, is that it will end up using a lot of the same technology, because that's where just a lot of the developer attention has been. That's where we're actually trying to solve real problems now. And ultimately it'll just be a peace dividend of all that competition in public blockchain space, that we will get some interesting, nice, blockchain platforms that we can use, that banks can use if they want to settle their internal ledgers. Yes.
So with regards to things like privacy, we've seen how OFAC's decision to impact Flashbots was also them integrating censorship at the NFTs boost layer. How do you reason about the expansion of private DEXs, private lending platforms in general, or even Tomato Cash, and how base layers, block builders interact with those systems? Do you think that we'll have groups of block builders that will censor, ones that won't censor? Will base layers exclude people that censor? How do that end up playing out?
Yeah, so I think the question is about base layer censorship and how it might affect the architecture of blockchains going forward. So for that, I'll point you to, I co-wrote a paper with some of my colleagues from the legal and policy teams at Paradigm that we put out last week, called Base Layer Neutrality. And this, I think, tries to cover exactly this issue. It doesn't, it's still very early in trying to figure out how exactly this all works. But I'll just point you to that art if you're interested in any of my thoughts on OFAC and transaction censoring. And again, I think the big question of what are the base layers' responsibilities here, I would definitely point you to that paper. So Base Layer Neutrality, published by Paradigm last week. Yes.
So in terms of the Ethereum scaling problem that you face, where do you think we are at? Have we solved the problem? After we solve the problem, we can do before, now that we can do before?
In terms of Ethereum scaling, have we solved the problem? Right. I do not think we've solved the problem, certainly. Not only are we not we're not, we don't see, we haven't been able to like dramatically increase Ethereum's scaling even with the solutions that we have. And we're not yet even on sort of a Moore's law like trajectory where we're improving every year. I think the improvements that we have are generally the sort of step functions, and they're from grabbing increasingly high pieces of fruit from the tree. I think there are paths that I think are plausible that Ethereum can use to scale, and I think a lot of really smart people are spending a lot of time really working hard on this. And this is true for Ethereum. It's true for any L1. I think nobody has solved L1 scaling in any sense. I think I think that's any particular blockchain is going to hit scaling constraints, and it's going to be it's going to take a lot of work to actually try to get a lot of improvement on those. I think we'll see significant improvement, but I think it'll take a lot of work. The scaling solution that has worked to date is launch another blockchain, and this is not a crazy scaling solution. The idea is just like if all the existing blockchains are too crowded, you just launch your own blockchain, and you can interoperate. You can send money to and from this blockchain from other ones, but you just run your app on a new chain. And this is kind of the core idea behind. And you can see a post that my colleague Charlie and I wrote a few years ago called the Cosmos Thesis, because this is partly some of the idea of how the Cosmos ecosystem, the core idea was meant to work, is that one way to scale blockchains is have a lot of them and have them be independent and not rely on like each other's security directly. But yeah, so I think that's the closest we've seen, but that doesn't solve necessarily the like single platform scaling problem. As for what we'll see if transactions are a lot cheaper, yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. And there's a lot of possible. I don't have like a really good snappy soundbite to it, but I think a lot of what people think is stupid today feels incrementally at least less stupid if transactions are very cheap. And so we might start seeing some applications that like today you just wouldn't architect your application that way. But yeah, I think like you might start to do if it was really cheap. And that's, yeah, I don't have a really concrete example for you. But yeah, I think you can start to see, for example, on-chain gaming with a lot more interactions on-chain. I think you can get fun things. This is a very fuzzy vision for me, but you can imagine just, it's a lot, and a lot of stuff that just like you just wouldn't think to do, because you'll have a bunch of people just trying it, trying different things will be, might happen, and people will actually land on interesting things. So that's my answer. It's honestly, like a lot of this is like, I don't know. Like that's why I'm an investor and not an entrepreneur, is I don't know. I think like I'm partly, I think, just looking for like what's going to actually enable the next thing. And also just again, you try not to see, I think it's really hard to just try to see 20 years ahead. Strategy is not about like seeing 20 years ahead. Nobody can see 20 years ahead. What you're trying to see is like, you're trying to see just like the next step. What's the next right thing for you to do? And then you just do that. And then you figure out, once you're on firm footing, what the step is after that. So that's how I try to think about this. Are there any other questions from online?
So I got one final question for you, Dan. So you walked us through kind of a whirlwind of all these different startups that are addressing different parts of the crypto stack. One of the things I've noticed that's unique about crypto is the fact that for all these areas, it tends to be startups that are solving these problems. It doesn't tend to be sort of big companies, incumbents, like, in the normal world, it seems to be the case that a lot of the biggest problems end up getting solved by really big companies that already have distribution, already have giant teams and lots of infrastructure. We've seen a lot of companies try to come into crypto, and we saw there was famously in 2017, Telegram tried to launch a blockchain. Of course, there was Libra, which was initially launched by Facebook and tried to build a blockchain. So far, these have not succeeded, or certainly not. There's a few things like Clayton that came out of Kakao from Korea. But they haven't succeeded anywhere near the scale of the crypto native, as we call them, startups. Why is that? Why is it that so many of the problems that you laid out, it's new startups and new teams that are effectively solving these problems?
Yeah. So I think this is one of potentially the really big advantages that crypto has over any other sector of the tech industry, which is that there's a significant diseconomy of scale where you might be able to do things as a crypto startup that you just would never do as a large company. And so this takes advantage of the innovator's dilemma, where it's just harder for big companies sometimes to do something. One reason might be because it disrupts their business model, but I think more often in crypto, it's because specifically they're worried about regulatory consequences for their entire company if they do this, right? And so Facebook was a good example where they put a lot of resources behind building Diem, Libra and Diem. They put a lot of resources. They wanted this to work, and just it's so hard for Facebook really to like do anything. And they're treated with such suspicion, I think, by politicians and policymakers often, that it just became impossible basically for them to even get this project launched. I think that's a big edge if you're just a person in your garage, because you are probably not going to find yourself, in the ordinary course of your business, you're not going to be a target of politicians trying to find something to a punching bag to hit, right? Like no one's actually like looking for things that you're doing wrong or to sort of call you out. And you don't have a big business that's threatened by potential regulatory action, so you can actually try a lot of stuff. And so there's been a lot more just I think innovation and just like permissionless innovation, where people are just like, all right, let's just try this, see if it sticks, and then we'll solve the other problems later. That again, like you have to solve those problems. The other problems are not going to go away, but you can try things. And again, I think there's a big advantage to that. And I do think, like from a policy perspective, it makes sense to be very careful with what the big tech companies can do, but to again not put as much advanced scrutiny on again like what startups are trying to do. So I think that's sort of the clear answer to that. Among others, I think it's just it's hard. Crypto, I think, it's something individualistic about it, which just grabs individual people's imagination very strongly. And so often you'll see founders who are just building something that really they can't even explain very well what they're doing. And so I think it can be hard for a big company to justify a big expenditure in that area. And it's happened at times, but yeah, I think it's because it is so weird and new. I think people just often, need to actually, maybe only one person is convinced that this makes any sense, and then they just have to prototype it themselves. And so like that's another reason I think it's hard to get buy-in on some of these. Even in the height of the blockchain hype, it was hard to get banks to like really put serious effort behind it. And I think correctly, like it would have been silly for them to do something. But yeah. Cool. Well, I think that's about our time. I'm happy to hang around for a few minutes after for the people in the room. But yeah, thanks so much for coming. Thanks, Steve and Don, for having me.
Thanks, Dan. That was awesome.
Great. Yeah, thanks a lot, everyone, for being here. And also for the students at Berkeley, remember the group formation deadline is due very, very soon. And also we'll send out more information about some of the grading criteria for class participation and other aspects. Great. Thank you.